I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you updates from the battlefront and hear about some of the incredible work done by Ukrainian medical professionals near the front lines.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's gonna break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 23rd of October, 2023, 1 year and 241 days since the full-scale invasion began. And joining me today is Associate Editor Dominic Nichols and our guests, writer and historian Justin Morozzi and Dr. Oksana Troyan from the Migrant Offshore Aid Station, or MOAS, medical charity. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Sure. Hi, David. Hi, everybody. So Russian forces continuing their push around Avdiivka to the east of the country, despite the failure of efforts last week, which seemingly resulted in very heavy casualties. Ukrainian military officials say Russian forces lost 50 tanks, another 100 armoured vehicles and 900 personnel during attacks around Avdiivka last week. We've no way of verifying that, but a lot of the social media that we've seen does speak of huge casualties and very, very poor tactics, so those numbers could very easily be accurate. Institute for the Study of War, citing a prominent Russian mill blogger, citing a Russian mill blogger who's claimed that Ukrainian forces counterattacked in the direction of Pisky, which is about 8 km southwest of Donetsk city itself, and pushed Russian forces from positions in the area, although other Russian sources disputed that in fairly voluble fashion, as you might expect. Now, geolocated footage, which we can put more credibility and more credence on, geolocated footage from Saturday indicates Russian forces have made marginal advances southeast of Pervmayska, which is that's about 10 km southwest of Avdiivka, 5 km northwest of Donetsk city itself. So still, it looks like Russia is still very much pushing to try and take Avdiivka, a two-pronged attack from the south and the north, trying to envelop the city. Not of any great strategic interest there, the city itself. It seems more symbolic, a bit like Bakhmut was last year. Russia hasn't had a significant victory of any scale, really, for a while, so they're pushing hard there. But the tactics are just the same as before, and they are losing a lot of people and equipment. Back to the weekend, and Russian missile strikes killed at least 6 postal workers, wounding another 16 on Saturday when they hit a mail depot in Ukraine's northeastern Kharkiv region, according to officials. President Zelensky shared a video on social media of what appeared to be a very heavily damaged warehouse surrounded by rubble and a container with the logo of Ukrainian postal operator Nova Pochta. Kharkiv Regional Governor Oleg Sigidbanov said at least 6 dead and 14 injured as a result of the occupiers' attack were employees of the company who were inside the Nova Pochta terminal. He continued, the victims, aged between 19 and 42, received shrapnel wounds and blast injuries. He then finished off by saying of those injured being treated in hospital, at least 7 were in a serious condition. The Ministry of Internal Affairs confirmed that death toll, but then updated the number of injured to 16, which is what I said at the start. Now, Sergei Nozhka, who works for Nova Pochta, he described the condition of some of his colleagues as mild to moderate severity, adding there are some people in a very serious condition, as you'd expect from high explosive. He said a rocket flew into the neighbouring depot, but at hours 2, the windows and shutters flew out. This is not the first time. According to the regional prosecutor's office, Russian forces in the Belgorod region north of Kharkiv, so in Russia, over the border in Russia, fired S-300 missiles, 2 of which hit the warehouse. Dmitry Chubenko, who's the office spokesman, he told Ukraine's state broadcaster debris analysis continues at the site in order to establish the exact number of injured and dead. Next, on Sunday, officials in the south of Ukraine said the Russian military had used a record number of aerial bombs over the Kherson region in the previous 24 hours, so Saturday to Sunday. Natalia Humenyuk, who's the spokesperson for the Ukrainian military's Operational Command South, said 36 missiles had been recorded over the area, some villages hit by several strikes. And then in their daily update on Saturday, the ISW said Russian forces could well be diversifying the mix of missiles, guided bombs, drones, all the other bits and bobs they're using in strikes at the moment on Ukraine, possibly in an attempt to find gaps in Ukraine's air defences, technical and geographic, ahead of further strikes that are anticipated for the winter, just like last winter, the sort of war on energy. Expecting that again this winter, and they're looking for gaps in the defences. Then also sticking with Sunday, in fact last night, Russian shelling hit a thermal power station in the Donetsk region, according to officials in Kyiv. The Interior Ministry said there'd been a large fire, and DTEK, Ukraine's largest private energy company, reported one of its thermal power stations had been shelled by Russia, but no further details there of any injuries or damage. And then today, Ukraine's Air Force said overnight Sunday to Monday it had shot down 14 drones, including 13 of the Iranian-made Shahed 131, 136, and another unspecified drone, as well as a cruise missile. Just looking at the British Defence Intelligence updates over the weekend, just worth pointing out. I think this was Saturday's actually, but they're talking about Avdiivka. They're saying that the recent assaults, last week's assaults on Avdiivka, have contributed to a 90% increase in Russian casualties recorded by Ukrainian MOD. As again, said, it's difficult, impossible for us to verify those figures. But since February last year, so the British Ministry of Defence saying Russia has significantly increased its force footprint on the ground in Ukraine by intensifying recruitment, using financial incentives, the partial mobilisation conducted last autumn, which we know was deeply unpopular in the country, which is why Putin's continued to try to mobilise by stealth. British Defence Intelligence saying that increase in personnel is the major factor behind Russia's ability to both defend held territory and conduct costly assaults. They say it's likely that Russia has suffered 150 to 190,000 permanent casualties, so that's killed and permanently wounded, since February last year, with the total figure, including temporarily wounded, i.e. those who either have recovered or could be expected to go back to service, in the region of 240 to 290,000. That 290,000 figure tallies with the latest estimates from the Ukrainian authorities. Now, that does not include Wagner or any of the other mercenary groups or the prisoner battalions who were forced to fight in Bakhmut. It probably also doesn't include fighters from the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic, the militia there, but they are staggering figures and speak of, I mean, it's very tricky. How do you train your military whilst in contact with the enemy? Do you take your experienced people away from the front in order to train the next cohort, and thereby you take a gap where the fighting is, or do you use less experienced people madly scrambling through the PowerPoint slides and the notes and the books and the doctrine of old, trying to make sense of it and then and training people themselves? But it is a very tricky problem, experienced to a similar but lesser degree by Ukraine, I would suggest, because they are the training of Ukrainian service personnel is continuing by external supporters of Ukraine outside of the country, so that to a certain degree that is alleviated, but just the numbers, the scale of it is still a very, very significant problem for Ukraine. And I'll take a little pause there, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom Nichols, for all of that. Well, it's a great pleasure to introduce Justin Morozzi and Dr. Oksana Troyan from medical charity MOAS. Just to start us off, Justin and Oksana, would you like to just introduce yourselves and explain a little bit about what you've been doing in Ukraine?
Hi everyone, my name is Oksana. I'm an anesthesiologist and I work in MOAS. It's an organization which evacuate patients from frontline light hospitals to major regional Ukraine hospitals. Also, we work at stabilization point near frontline and have two ambulances with ophthalmological and general care support. We do it in places where is no other medical aid.
Thank you very much, Oksana. Justin.
Hi, David. Very good to join you. I first came across MOAS earlier this spring when a friend asked me if I would like to drive an ambulance out to Ukraine with him. And I did, and was incredibly impressed by what I saw. It's an organization of 150 all Ukrainian, well-paid medics, nurses, and drivers. And it's a very niche job they do, which is providing emergency evacuation to critically injured soldiers. So most NGOs are not comfortable working so closely with the military. MOAS is exceptional in that it does exactly that, because that is where the greatest need is. And as we speak, MOAS has saved more than 30,000 lives, hasn't lost a single soldier under their care, operating with 50 ambulances and 150 medical staff and drivers.
Can I ask, just to start us off then, because I know Dom's got lots of questions, when you describe a stabilization point, Justin and Oksana, could you just paint us a picture of what does that actually look like when you're at one? What if you could describe it to listeners through your mind's eye, what's at a stabilization point and what does it do?
At stabilization point, wounded person can receive first medical aid. It's professional aid. There is surgeons, anesthesiologists, traumatologists, etc. And the patient can be intubated, and have maybe some small operation. And it's first doctor which patient can see. It's high skilled doctors.
Thank you, Oksana. And Justin, if you'd just like to describe, what does it look like?
The stabilization points I've seen, they vary quite a lot. MOAS is operating at multiple locations, all behind the front line, but quite close to the front line. In some cases, let's say 20 kilometers or something like that. In some of the locations, MOAS are co-located with Ukrainian army medics, and those tend to be some of the more dangerous positions, which have received incoming fire as well. They vary between small, pristine, some are slightly ramshackle. All the ones I've seen have been very well supplied in terms of medical equipment and supplies. In some of these locations, you have a MOAS surgeon in addition to being anesthesiologist. Most of the MOAS teams, I should say, all of them have a doctor in their team, 3-people teams. And the importance of having an anesthetist, they call them anesthesiologists here, the importance of having that level of professionalism is that you can keep an intubated patient alive on what in Ukraine can be extremely long evacuations. Oksana, for example, one of her most typical routes is a 4-hour evacuation to the nearest regional hospital. So it's an 8-hour round trip. And she's just been telling me in some occasions she's doing 2 of those a day, working 20-hour days. Unfortunately, there is a very high injury toll.
Justin and Oksana, it's Dom here. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'd be keen, first of all, to just have a look at the organisation, if I may. So, Justin, if you wouldn't mind introducing MOAS, where it first came about from, and how it became involved in Ukraine. And Oksana, your own personal story. Were you in the medical profession before the start of the full-scale invasion? How did you get involved with MOAS and in this specialism in particular?
Thanks, Tom. I'll kick off then with some background on MOAS. 2013, Chris Catrimbone and his wife were in the Mediterranean on holiday and came across a discarded man's overcoat in the water alongside them. They were having a lovely holiday, realized that this coat was probably clothing from a migrant who may well have drowned. And it was like an epiphany for them. They set up this humanitarian organization called MOAS, and that stands for Migrant Offshore Aid Station. And Chris bought a ship and literally started fishing migrants out of the Mediterranean. They saved up to, I think, around 40,000 lives. So a decade on, the war in Ukraine was about to kick off. Chris actually arrived before the war, a month or two, anticipating there would be a need for some humanitarian services. He wasn't quite sure what. And I think swiftly came to the conclusion that there would be a huge need for frontline medical care with an emergency evacuation operation, because as said a moment ago, a lot of organizations aren't so comfortable working so closely with the military, and he forecasts a lack of capacity in that area, and MOAS has been helping fill that. So I'll pass over to Oksana for her personal background with MOAS.
I joined MOAS about 10 months ago, about a year. Before I worked at civilian hospital, and we treat wounded soldiers and civilians as well. And I thought I can do more. I'm not afraid, and I can work closer to frontline. So I left my hospital and joined MOAS. So now I feel myself more like realized professionally.
Thanks both. And Oksana, just sticking on that, you say you treat civilians and the military. Can you tell us where the dividing lines are between the work MOAS does and the established Ukrainian military medical services? How you fit into it all?
I'm just going to explain this. I'll jump in a bit on that, Dom, if I may. The overwhelming majority of MOAS patients are critically injured soldiers. That means they're in imminent danger of death if they're not given the right care. MOAS has an agreement with the Ministry of Health to be providing the services it does, which are directly to the Ukrainian armed forces. Having said that, there is also a civilian healthcare that MOAS offers through 2 mobile medical units, and these provide ophthalmological, can't even pronounce it, services and primary healthcare. Like for us Brits, that would be GP services. But the ambulance operation is almost exclusively soldiers.
Gotcha, thanks. Oksana, is there anything such as a typical day for you? Could you describe such a thing if it exists?
Typically, we start more work usually at the evenings or night. We came to the field hospitals, pick up patients. We treat patients before or prepare them for ROT if they need. And after preparing, we bring patients to the main regional hospitals on the east of Ukraine, like this. We have several locations, and at my previous location, there was like 2 or 3 hours trip. Now it can take about 8 or 9 hours. So it like quite hard for patient and for doctors be taken for so long distance.
Thanks. Justin, if I may, I'm really interested in the differentiation that you emphasised earlier on between, or to say that all of MOAS people are staff. They are employees, not volunteers. And that's a very, very specific reason that you mentioned as we were chatting earlier on. Can you just talk to us about why that was so important, that the model of MOAS is to have well-paid staff rather than well-meaning volunteers?
Yeah, that's a really good question and very interesting, Dom. I arrived this summer, by which time the volunteer model had already been taken over by the paid Ukrainian staff model. What happened, I believe, in the earliest days, so this is going back to February, lots of interest, lots of volunteers coming from all over the world, UK, US, South Africa, Israel. Eventually, it didn't work out so well because a lot of the volunteers were sort of chopping and changing, going on leave, rotating, kind of as they felt like it, I think, because there wasn't that kind of discipline of being a paid employee. And at some point, Chris came to that decision of, we need professional paid Ukrainians. And at that point, it went over to 100% Ukrainian model, which is really impressive. This is not foot crawling with foreign medics. It's the opposite. There are no foreign medics. There are no foreign drivers. Everyone in the team, Ukrainian. And someone, like Oksana, who's, I noticed, been compared to a modern day Florence Nightingale, highly qualified, highly professional, incredibly committed, patriotic. And all of the teams have their Oksana characters as the senior medic, the senior anaesthetist.
Thanks. Now, Oksana, we've heard various reports of medical facilities and ambulances being directly targeted by Russian forces. Have you any experience of that? Has there been any locations you've been at that have been under fire when it's been clearly marked as a medical facility, or any of your ambulances ever been in contact?
I think you mentioned there was that time your convoy was there was some Russian fire and you had to stop and you had a patient in your ambulance.
Oh yes, it was a funny story. At once there was like a Shahed behind us.
That's the Iranian drone, the Shahed.
And we stopped and switched off lights in our car. And we was wearing a team always wear bulletproof jackets, and we have helmet on our heads. But my patient, he was conscious and he was like naked, just in blanket, in some medical clothes. So when this head was about us, it was about a bit scary, and patient was carried as well, because we was totally equipment and he was naked. And I told him if like was some explosion, I will lie on him. And he told like, oh, finally something good happens to him, like this.
Steady on, Oksana. It's not that kind of show.
And a couple of other locations, I should add, more seriously as well, have been hit. No one has been killed, but there have been a number of injuries in different locations from Russian artillery fire.
God, it's terrible. And how does the team? How do you then manage the team? What kind of specialisms do you have across all the medical professionals you have, and how do you organise where they go in the country and what kind of rotas and what have you?
So it's anesthesiologist, the nurse, we have surgeons, traumatologist, and otolaryngologist. One I know, but there is different specialists and different locations, so I maybe don't know about all locations.
The anaesthetists are the core, the kind of theme that runs through the MOAS teams, that every single team has an anaesthetist, as opposed to just maybe a lesser qualified paramedic. And all of the team members are also qualified in emergency, emergency first aid, trauma.
Anesthesiologist is the same like intensive care specialist in our country.
Thanks. And the last one from me before I open the floor to David. You say it was kicked off by Christopher Catrimboni, but how are you funded on a regular basis now, and where do you get your supplies from? And do you have any critical gaps either in specialisms of individuals or the supplies you're getting through?
Thanks, Dom. The MOAS does not receive $1 from the American government or £1 from the British government. It receives no government funding at all. It relies exclusively on individual donations. There are a number of wealthy American donors who've been extremely generous, but there's always a concern that those sort of the wealthiest donors can also lose interest. The war, Israel-Hamas, has already distracted attention from Ukraine, which is a real concern. The overall size, I mentioned earlier, 150 medics in 50 ambulances. It's costing over $1 million a month to run this operation. So it's a huge undertaking. Chris has put a lot of his own money into this as well. But the seeking donations is a constant, really. And the equation is no fundraising, no MOAS, Ukrainian soldiers will die. But I don't think there will be shortages of, in terms of filling spaces. The MOAS is at the size it is now with the sort of finances that it has in place.
Well, thanks, Justin and Oksana. Yeah, a couple of more questions from me. I'm quite interested to hear from you about how you think your operation has changed in the past year, particularly on the medical side. I mean, what have you learned from doing this day in, day out? And how have you changed what you've done to make it more effective? Thanks.
For this, for my experience, I think now we have more severe injured patients. And now maybe let this couple of maybe last 3 weeks, we have a very lot of calls.
A lot of emergency call-outs.
And all patients like red, they need high qualified and emergency, like urgent medical aid.
Thanks, Oksana. Justin, would you add anything to that?
I think one of the, I suppose, obvious things would be the locations have changed, but that's just a function of how the war has evolved. So MOAS goes where it's needed. As the front line has changed, the MOAS follows it behind the front line. Some of the locations have received more fire than I think was the case in the earliest days. It remains a very dangerous occupation for Oksana and teams like hers. And I think also, as Oksana just referred to, there has been a greater casualty count. We don't talk about numbers. The Ukrainian government doesn't talk about numbers, but anecdotally and unfortunately, teams like Oksana's are extremely busy.
Absolutely. Well, looking back over the past 19, 20 months for both of you, what are the memories that really stand out? I don't know who would like to go first, Oksana or Justin.
Maybe some severe injured patients when they had clinical death, cardiac arrest, and then they survived. It's maybe the best memories from my work there.
I've talked to a number of the medics in the teams, and they tell us that being extremely professional medics, they have to remain dispassionate and not involved emotionally. But frequently, they also have a green patient, sometimes in their vehicles, who's more like walking wounded, who then tells them all sorts of fairly heartrending stories. For me personally, I found it a very strange mixture of, at times, exhilaration when you feel you're doing a good job responding to a critical need, and then very dark moments of sort of close to despair when you see what has been referred to as the butcher's bill of this war, and you see young men out in an operating theatre or in the back of an ambulance extremely badly injured. I was looking at some photographs today of the MOAS time in Ukraine, and there's one picture of an ambulance with a sort of a swimming pool of blood in the back, and some of the injuries have been absolutely horrendous. But I think MOAS is an amazing organisation and a force for good. And God knows it would be a lot worse if MOAS or organisations like this were not doing what they do, and people like Oksana, who are literally saving lives every day.
Could we talk a little bit about the next few months? Obviously, the temperature is dropping, winter is approaching. Will what you do change because of that? And if so, how so?
To compare with the winter, previous months was really busy, very, very busy. We don't have such a lot of patients in winter, actually. There was no much bad injuries.
So hopefully a slightly less busy time for you, Oksana. Justin, from your perspective, will anything change going into the next few months? Will there be new priorities or new ways of doing what you do?
I'm not quite sure. I mean, I don't have the length of time in country that Oksana has, so I couldn't compare it with I wasn't here in a previous winter, but I think one hopes as well that the casualty count will come down markedly as operations become less intensive. I think there's a great hope for that. I think there is, looking ahead though, there's also that kind of I felt it just in my last 2 weeks here. For example, the media interest. We know media attention can be rather short-term sometimes. And there is a concern that Ukraine might be more neglected or more forgotten with the terrible new conflict in the Middle East as well. So that remains a concern for sure.
Well, thank you so much, Justin and Oksana. Just a final question from me. I mean, is there anything we haven't asked you about that you think is important to speak about, that you would want our listeners around the world to understand about the work you do and the reality of the war in Ukraine as you see it?
Okay, so I would like to read you a epigraph from Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls. Is it okay?
Please.
No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clot be washed away by the sea, Europe is less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as any manner of the friends of their own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I'm involved in mankind, and therefore never stand to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee.
Thank you, Oksana. Justin.
Fantastic, thank you. Earlier this summer, we had a visit from the Rolling Stone magazine. And I just wanted to end with a few words from the journalist Adam Hay Nichols' conclusion. And he writes, "It was only after the February 2022 invasion that Western governments took notice and decided to help." This is referring back to the earlier Russian invasion of 2014. MOAS was ahead of them on that, preempting the war and getting its logistics lined up a month in advance. But they and Ukraine need more support. Countries like the US, UK, and Germany are providing weapons, but nowhere near enough aid. Katrin Boni and his 150 medics are carrying the can. That Land Cruiser I drove over is already saving lives, lots of them, before I even got out of the country. I understand where the indomitable will of its people now comes from. Ukraine is a beautiful country, and it must remain free. Sergei is right. There will be no surrender. So my message would be, please don't forget Ukraine. If you're interested in what the sort of work that MOAS is doing, please have a look at the website. And if anyone is interested in donating, it's moas.eu/donate. And that's MOAS, MOAS.eu/donate. And thank you very much for that opportunity to share our story with you, Dom and Andrew.
Thank you very much, Justin and Oksana. Dom Nichols, can I come to you for your very final thoughts?
Yes, thanks. And Justin, thanks for saying how folks can donate there. I have actually had a few messages as we've been talking, asking how folk can help. So thank you for that. And you can actually help me out with my final thought. My final thought here is about how much longer the fighting season in its current form is going to last. Winters are going to set in, and before that we're going to have some very difficult environmental conditions before everything freezes. Now, we know Russia has been getting a resupply of ammunition from North Korea, especially. We know they've been mobilizing personnel by stealth, as I mentioned earlier on, but the armoured vehicles they are losing and other equipment around Avdiivka, they are much, much harder to replace, let alone to train on. Russia seemingly decided that Avdiivka is worth the sacrifice there, possibly for symbolic reasons, a bit like Bakhmut, and for the reasons I was saying earlier. But they're going to need to get a bit of a move on if they want to take that city before everything grinds to a frozen halt. And so I would expect there to be another very, very violent week in that area. And I just wondered if so with that thought in mind, whether, before you address your final thought, Justin and Oksana, whether or not you could give us a view on what the weather is, literally what the weather is at the moment in the areas you've been travelling around in. How much longer do you think it's going to be before winter really starts to bite where you are?
I'm not an expert on Ukrainian winters, Dom, at all. I might ask Oksana for her thoughts on that in a second. But as we're speaking, it's about 21 degrees and sunny, slightly strange. Autumn is here, but it's actually feeling like late summer at the moment. But I'm assuming the temperatures will start plunging quite soon, the back end of October into November.
I don't know actually as well, but where is the evil, and I think the worst will be in our world until this evil will leave.
I think Oksana's talking about the Russian evil.
Well, thank you, Dom, Justin and Oksana. Any final thoughts, Justin and Oksana, before we wrap up?
Just help Ukraine.
And yes, I think really echoing Oksana's thoughts that, if it is going to become harder for the conflict in Ukraine to remain at this very high level of awareness, that is going to be a problem. So yes, please keep the interest going, keep the support going. Thanks so much for your excellent Ukraine podcast, which is doing precisely that. MOAS depends on a certain level of awareness and interest in its operations. And I was inspired enough to come and join them part-time, having just visited them and never heard of MOAS earlier this spring. But so interested in and impressed by the work they do here. It is literally about saving lives. That's what they do day in, day out. And thank God they're here. And they need all the support that's available. People like Oksana, who are just doing very heroic work day in, day out, exhausting long days, and seeing horrendous injuries and keeping these poor men and women alive.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.